Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always ready to explore some new ideas.
So today we're going to tackle something I think we all struggle with at some point, fear. And to guide us through this messy world of fear, we've got the wisdom of Jiddu Krishnamurti.
A brilliant mind. I always find his perspective so insightful.
Yeah, he really challenges us to think differently about everything, really.
It does.
And we're going to be looking specifically at two of his works. One is called, appropriately enough, On Fear, and the other is Krishnamurti's Notebook.
Both packed with insights on fear, thought, awareness, all sorts of things.
Right, and I think right off the bat, it's worth acknowledging that fear is like this universal human experience, right? I mean, who hasn't grappled with fear at some point in their lives?
Oh, absolutely. It's part of the human condition. It's how we've survived.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Krishnamurti's approach to fear, it's not about, offering some kind of quick fix or a 5-step plan to conquer it. No, not at all. He encourages us to really examine it, to understand its nature, its roots, and how our relationship with it, how we might actually be perpetuating it.
Okay, now that's interesting. So where do we even begin to sort of untangle all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with Krishnamurti's emphasis on observation. And what he means by that is not ignoring fear, not pretending it's not there, but really looking at it without immediately trying to suppress it, analyze it, or escape from it.
Okay, so if I'm feeling, I don't know, like that familiar surge of panic before, say, giving a big presentation, I shouldn't try to distract myself or talk myself out of it. I should just sit with it.
Yes, but not in a way that's judgmental or critical. It's more about approaching that feeling, that fear, with a kind of curiosity. Like saying to yourself, look at that, fear's showing up.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'll admit that feels a little counterintuitive. Like my instinct is to kind of fight fear, to push it away. Is that what Krishnamurti's getting at when he talks about the word fear itself being a trigger?
You've hit on a key point there. The word itself, the label fear, it can actually amplify the feeling, right? Because when we label it as fear, we create a separation between ourselves and the experience. It becomes this big, scary monster that we have to battle.
Right.
But what if we could just observe those sensations and thoughts, just notice them without that label, without that immediate resistance?
Okay, I'm starting to see how that could shift things. But you mentioned earlier that Krishnamurti connects fear to our perception of time. Can you unpack that a little?
Absolutely. So think about it. How often are our fears rooted in the past? In memories of painful experiences or in anxieties about what might happen in the future. We're either reliving old hurts or worrying about what-ifs that haven't even happened yet.
So you're saying that by dwelling on that embarrassing moment from high school, I'm actually keeping that fear alive in the present.
Exactly. And it's not just about the past either. Think about all the fears that stem from our worries about the future. Will I lose my job? Will I get sick? Will I end up alone? All projections, all based on a future that hasn't even arrived.
Wow, it's like we're constantly torturing ourselves with fears that might never even come true. But then what role does thought play in all of this?
Well, Krishnamurti would argue that thought is what keeps this whole cycle of fear in motion. Because thought is based on memory, on past experiences, right? And it keeps us chained to the past and projecting those same patterns onto the future.
So it's like this vicious loop. The past informs our thoughts, which create anxieties about the future, and all of that fuels the fear we're experiencing right now in this moment.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting. Krishnamurti suggests that thought itself creates this illusion of separation, a separation between the me and the fear.
Oh, I see.
We start to see fear as this external enemy that we have to fight against, rather than just as a temporary experience that's happening within us.
Yeah, I mean, this whole me versus fear idea, that's so ingrained in our culture. But what if that separation is actually part of the problem?
That's the radical shift Krishnamurti's pointing to. To really understand fear, we have to go beyond this duality, beyond this idea of a separate observer and a separate observed.
Wait, are you saying that the me that's experiencing the fear is actually not separate from the fear itself?
That's the profound insight he's offering. And this leads us to one of his most mind-bending concepts. The observer is the observed. We're going to delve into that a bit later, but I'm curious, what's standing out to you so far?
Honestly, my head is spinning a little bit, but I can already see how just understanding this link between fear, thought, and time, how that could be incredibly liberating. If we can step out of that cycle, maybe we can actually start to experience true freedom from fear.
You're definitely on the right track. And there's so much more to explore here. For instance, Krishnamurti also talks about how comparison and dependency fuel our fears.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Let's unpack that next. Okay, so we've been exploring Krishnamurti's ideas about fear, how our thoughts and our perception of time kind of keep us trapped in that cycle. But you mentioned something before about comparison and dependency also playing a role. Before we jump into that observer is the observed idea, can we talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, definitely. Think about the everyday anxieties that we all face. How often do they stem from comparing ourselves to others? Like feeling like we're not successful enough, attractive enough, or just, well, enough.
Oh, gosh, all the time. I feel like social media is basically a breeding ground for that kind of comparison and self-doubt. But how does that really tie into fear?
Well, it creates this fear of inadequacy, right? This fear of not measuring up. And that fear can push us to constantly seek external validation, to constantly strive to be something we're not, which ultimately just leads to more suffering.
It's like we're always looking outside of ourselves for this sense of worthiness, which, yeah, that's kind of setting ourselves up for failure.
Exactly. And it's not just about comparison. Krishnamurti also talks about dependency. We become attached to external things, possessions, relationships, even beliefs. We think they're going to fill this void within us. But that attachment, it breeds fear. Fear of losing those things, fear of being alone, fear of emptiness.
So we're like clinging to these crutches, these external crutches for this sense of security, but it's actually making us more vulnerable to fear. I can see how this feeds into the cycle we were talking about before. But then where do we go from here? Is he saying we should renounce all our possessions and relationships and, become hermits in a cave or something?
He's not advocating for a rejection of the world, right? It's more about recognizing what our attachments really are and how they might be driving our fears and understanding that real security, real happiness, well, it can't be found in things and external things.
So it's more about shifting our perspective than making these drastic life changes.
Yeah. Exactly. Recognizing that true fulfillment comes from within, from self-acceptance, understanding, not from chasing external validation or holding on to things that can be taken away.
Okay, but how do we actually apply this in everyday life? What does it actually look like to face our fears without getting completely overwhelmed by them? Krishnamurti keeps talking about observation, but I'm still not totally clear on how to actually do that, to put it into practice.
Well, it's about bringing a mindful awareness to your experience. So let's say you're feeling that familiar knot in your stomach, before a big presentation. Instead of trying to just ignore it or push it away, what if you just acknowledge that it's there?
So not pretending the fear isn't there, but kind of changing how I relate to it.
Exactly. And it starts with observation. Notice the physical sensations, the tightness in your chest, the racing heart, the sweaty palms. Notice the thoughts that are swirling around in your head. I'm going to mess this up. They're going to judge me. I'm not good enough.
That's helpful, I guess, in terms of understanding what's happening in my body and in my mind. But wouldn't that actually make the fear more intense?
The key here is you're observing without judgment. You're not engaging in this battle with the fear. You're not trying to analyze it or figure it out. You're simply noticing with a sense of curiosity and acceptance.
So instead of getting caught up in that story,
Right.
It's a story that fear is telling me, I'm just acknowledging that it's there without getting swept away by it.
Exactly. And as you practice this, something really interesting starts to happen. You start to create this space, this gap between you and the fear. So it's no longer this overwhelming force that controls you. It becomes an object of observation, just a temporary experience that's arising and passing within you.
Okay, I'm starting to get this, but it definitely feels like a skill you have to develop. It's like building a muscle of awareness.
Absolutely. Krishnamurti emphasizes that this is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time achievement, and it requires patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to stay present with whatever comes up, even when it's uncomfortable.
So it sounds like this approach is really about changing our relationship with fear, not about eliminating it completely.
Yes. Fear is a natural part of the human experience. It keeps us safe from danger, right?
Yeah.
But so often, our fears, they're based on conditioned responses, societal programming, not on actual threats.
This reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, the distinction between instinctive fear and conditioned fear. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Instinctive fear, that's that primal, gut level response to danger. What makes you jump back from a cliff, swerve to avoid a car accident. It's essential for survival. But conditioned fear, that's different. That's learned through our experiences, our upbringing, all those messages we absorb from our culture.
So like fear of public speaking, fear of failure, fear of rejection, those are often learned responses, not some innate part of who we are.
Exactly. And by recognizing that, we can start to question those fears. Are they serving us?
Yeah.
Are they based in reality? Or are they holding us back from living a more fulfilling life?
I'm seeing how this all ties together. By understanding the origins of our fears and by learning to just observe them without judgment, we can start to break free. But what about those really deep-seated fears, the ones that feel almost impossible to shake? Krishnamurti mentioned that fear can operate on multiple levels, right? Like there's the surface level, but then there's this whole other layer of like unconscious fears lurking beneath.
You're absolutely right. And those hidden fears, those can be the most challenging to address because we often don't even know they're there until something triggers them.
So how do we even begin to uncover those deeper fears? It's not like we can just, force ourselves to confront them.
It's a process of self-discovery,
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to those subtle cues, the patterns that show up in our lives.
So not digging around in the dark trying to force those fears out. It's more about creating a space of awareness where they can naturally come to the surface.
You got it. And when those deeper fears do arise, we approach them with that same gentle observation we've been talking about. Just notice them without judgment, without resistance. We allow them to be there, allow them to breathe, allow them to express themselves. But we don't get caught up in those storylines.
This whole process, it feels like such a delicate balance. It's like acknowledging the reality of fear without letting it, completely consume us.
It is a delicate dance. And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another. But those core principles, they stayed the same. To observe without judgment, to understand the root of our fears, and to recognize that we're not our fears. We are something much, much vaster, much more expansive.
This has been so insightful, but I feel like there's still more to unpack here, especially that idea of the observer being the observed. Can we delve into that next?
All right, so we've explored a lot of Krishnamurti's ideas about fear. We've talked about how our thoughts and our perception of time can trap us in that cycle of fear. We've also discussed how comparing ourselves to others and becoming dependent on external things can really fuel those fears. But there's this one concept we've been circling back to, and it feels like the key to really unlocking a new understanding of fear. Krishnamurti's idea that the observer is the observed. And this is, I have to admit, the part I've been struggling with the most. Can we dig into that a little more?
Absolutely. It's definitely one of Krishnamurti's most profound insights. And I think it has the potential to be really transformative, but it can also be one of the most difficult to really grasp. I mean, it challenges our fundamental assumptions about who we are, how we experience the world.
I think what trips me up is this idea that the me that's experiencing the fear, that's somehow not separate from the fear itself. It feels so counterintuitive. Well, think about how we usually talk about fear. We say things like, I'm afraid of heights, or I'm struggling with anxiety. It reinforces this idea that there's a separate I, an observer, that's somehow standing apart from the fear, the observed.
Right, like there's a me over here, and then there's this fear over there, and there are these two totally distinct things.
Exactly, but what Krishnamurti is suggesting is that this separation, this duality, it's an illusion, it's a construct of thought. He's pointing to a deeper reality where the observer and the observed are actually one.
Okay, so how does that apply to fear? Are you saying that I am the fear?
It's not quite that simple. It's not about merging with the fear or letting it consume us. It's more about recognizing that there's no separate I that's having the experience of fear. The fear, it arises within consciousness, within that field of awareness that we so often mistake for a separate self.
So it's like the fear is just another wave, in the ocean of consciousness, and we're getting so caught up in the idea that we're somehow separate from the ocean itself.
That's a great analogy. And when we begin to see through that illusion of separation, that's when things start to shift.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this might play out, like in real life?
Sure. Let's go back to that presentation example. You're sitting there, your heart's pounding, your palms are sweating, all these thoughts racing through your head. But instead of getting lost in that story of, oh no, I'm going to mess this up, everyone's going to judge me, you shift your attention, your awareness to the one who's having those thoughts.
So it's like taking a step back and observing the observer. Instead of being lost in what the thoughts are saying, I'm noticing the I that's thinking them.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment of noticing, you're no longer completely identified with the fear. You're creating a space, a gap between you and the experience.
And in that space, I can start to see that the fear isn't, it's not all of who I am. It's just a temporary experience. A sensation, a thought pattern that's just passing through.
That's it. And as you keep practicing this, you'll find that the fear starts to lose its grip on you. It might still arise, but you'll be less reactive to it, less likely to get totally swept away by its stories. You'll have cultivated a sense of spaciousness, a kind of awareness that allows you to be with those challenging moments with more ease.
It's starting to make more sense now. But it still feels like a pretty radical shift in perspective, something that's going to take, well, a lot of practice.
You're right, it's not a quick fix, it's a journey of self-discovery, a gradual unfolding of awareness. But the more you explore these ideas, the more you play with this shift in perspective, the more those insights will start to, show up in your everyday life.
This deep dive, this has been amazing. We've explored so much of what Krishnamurti had to say about fear, from its roots in thought and time to this really mind-bending concept of the observer being the observed. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for how to understand and deal with fear, and I'm really excited to see how these ideas continue to unfold for me.
Well, it's been wonderful exploring this with you. And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners today is this. Can you look at your own fears without judgment, without resistance, without that immediate urge to run away? Can you see their true nature? Can you see how they come from thought and time, how they create this illusion of separation? If you can start to do that, you're already on the path to freedom. And remember, Krishnamurti's work is so vast, so insightful. If these ideas resonated with you, I really encourage you to explore more of his work. You might just discover a whole new dimension of freedom within yourself.